In the quiet of an ordinary evening, a shattered trust stirs the darkness. What would you do if you uncovered your spouse's deepest betrayal? Imagine discovering your wife has been unfaithful, and not just once, but in ways that defy belief. The sting of betrayal cuts deep, and the raw desire for revenge bubbles beneath the surface. Now, picture the man who learns of this deceit, a good man wronged, torn between the crushing weight of heartbreak and the magnetic pull of justice. His mind begins to churn with thoughts of exposure, payback, and the kind of reckoning no one could expect. This is no mere tale of heartbreak. It is the beginning of a journey where pain breeds power, and vengeance becomes the only answer. As anger simmers and thoughts of retribution take root, the protagonist is poised on the edge of something far darker than anyone could anticipate. The discovery of his wife's affair wasn't an intentional hunt for answers. It was a slip of fate, an accidental find. One evening, while rummaging through a drawer for a missing document, he stumbled across a series of text messages. The casual intimacy, the inside jokes, the secrets laced in every word. It was all there. A shiver ran down his spine, disbelief turning to shock in an instant. He could hardly make sense of it, as if his mind had refused to accept the cold reality before him. Every message, every photo, every confession seemed like a dagger aimed straight at his heart. How could she? The woman he had shared his life with, his trust, his dreams. How could she betray him so completely? In the initial moments, confusion reigned, followed by an overwhelming flood of anger. He couldn't breathe, as if the walls were closing in. Questions spiraled endlessly. Had she been unhappy? Was this a momentary lapse in judgment, or had it been going on for months? His world was upside down. Yet, beneath the hurt, a darker thought began to form. Revenge. At first, it was just a whisper, a fleeting idea that passed through his mind. But with every passing moment, that whisper grew louder, stronger. Was it possible that this could be the very thing that set everything right again? Revenge wasn't a choice he'd made lightly. The desire for justice simmered, a fire he could no longer ignore. Each waking hour was consumed by thoughts of what to do next. The quiet, steady planning began almost automatically, like his mind had shifted into a new mode, one focused on restoring balance at any cost. The first step was clear: confirmation. He needed the undeniable truth. So he took the plunge, searching through his wife's phone, quietly skimming through texts, emails, and even social media messages. The evidence was damning. There were explicit photos, secret rendezvous dates, and promises of forever with someone who was not him. At that moment, the psychological shift occurred. No longer was he a victim of her deceit. He was an avenger. Each piece of evidence, each new revelation, fed the fire within him, slowly replacing the pain with a fierce sense of power. He no longer felt helpless. He felt in control. But control of what? Revenge, sweet and satisfying revenge, would finally be his. In his mind, it became more than just righting a wrong. It was a battle for dignity, for closure, for proving that no one could get away with betrayal like this. The complexity of his emotions deepened: grief, fury, but most of all, a thirst for justice that no one could quench. The day of the confrontation arrived like a storm on the horizon, dark and full of anticipation. He'd planned everything down to the smallest detail, and now the moment of reckoning was here. His wife and her lover were meeting at a hotel. He knew the place, had tracked their movements for days. Armed with undeniable proof, he walked through the hotel's lobby, his heart pounding in his chest. He wasn't just confronting her, he was confronting the lie, the betrayal, the false love they had shared. As he approached their room, the sense of power was palpable, but so was the fear. What would happen next? Could he go through with it? The confrontation was explosive. His wife's face fell as she saw him standing there, a cold fury in his eyes. Her lover was still getting dressed, caught in the same web of deceit. She tried to deny it at first, to downplay her actions, but the evidence was irrefutable. The tension in the room thickened as she squirmed under the weight of her lies, her voice trembling with excuses, but nothing she said could break through the wall of anger he had built. For a moment, the silence between them seemed endless, as though time itself had paused. Then, the question hung in the air. Would he unleash his fury, or would the situation spiral further into chaos? The decision was in his hands, and no one, least of all him, knew what would happen next. Would justice be served, or would the consequences be far greater than anyone could anticipate? The fire began as a simple, deliberate act, a symbolic gesture of destruction to mirror the emotional devastation that consumed him. He'd always been a man of control, but in this moment, he was swept away by an overwhelming need to incite chaos, to burn everything down, much like his world had been scorched by betrayal. He set the fire to the sheets in the hotel room, lighting a small, controlled blaze on the bed. The flames were slow at first, curling upward with almost a peaceful grace before they began to roar to life. It was a message, one that burned hotter with each passing second, echoing the fury in his chest. The wife and her lover were oblivious at first, caught in the throes of their own passion. Then, the smoke began to seep into the room, curling up the walls and filling their lungs with panic. The wife's expression shifted from confusion to pure terror as the heat enveloped the room. She screamed, trying to push her lover out of the way, but the flames were relentless, growing larger by the second. Her lover scrambled to open the window, but there was no escape. In a panic, they both reached for the bedsheet, tying it to the window ledge in a desperate attempt to climb down. The wife, trembling, nearly slipped as the sheet unraveled in her hands. The fear in her eyes mirrored the chaos of the moment, and the protagonist's heart pounded in his chest as he watched, half afraid they might escape, half desiring to see the fire consume it all. Would they make it out? Could he allow them to flee after everything? The suspense was unbearable. His hand trembled as he considered whether to call for help or to let the flames do what they were meant to. Would he stop this or let it burn, forever marking their lives as the ashes rose? The fire wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. As the flames in the hotel room began to die down and emergency crews arrived, the protagonist took a final dramatic step to make sure the affair would never be forgotten. He didn't just want them to pay in private. He wanted the entire world to witness the humiliation. Using his resources, he hacked into a live news feed, syncing the affair's details with a major local news broadcast. As cameras rolled, the images of his wife, once viewed as an icon of perfection, were splashed across every screen. The affair, every sordid detail, was suddenly public knowledge. The audience watched in stunned silence as her face appeared, one of terror and disbelief. Her lover's identity was revealed alongside hers. The wife's frantic attempts to silence the broadcast, to explain her actions, were futile. Public humiliation crashed down on her like a ton of bricks, her every lie exposed for the world to see. The protagonist's heart raced as he watched the broadcast unfold. A strange satisfaction bloomed inside him, but it was quickly tempered with an unsettling sensation. Was this really justice? Was this truly the kind of retribution he'd wanted? The bitterness of guilt slowly seeped in, mingling with the satisfaction of seeing his wife and her lover brought down. But was it enough? Was this the end? Or would it leave an even deeper scar on him, one that might never heal? After the broadcast, the protagonist's rage didn't subside. Instead, it shifted focus, growing even more intense as he considered the lover, the man who had so carelessly waltzed into his life. He couldn't stop now. The fire had burned, the humiliation had been delivered, but there was more to be done. The lover's life would be destroyed as well. Armed with his stolen possessions, his phone, his wallet, his car keys, the protagonist methodically went through the lover's belongings, seizing every personal item that held power. The wallet contained identification, bank cards, even a few incriminating receipts. The lover's car keys were a prize he couldn't leave behind. It was a simple car, but to the lover, it represented status. To the protagonist, it was just another thing to take. Next, he dug into the lover's laptop, hoping to find a trail that would lead him deeper into the web of deceit. The laptop was a treasure trove of secrets, emails detailing illicit deals, shady transactions, and enough information to ruin this man's life entirely. As the protagonist sifted through these revelations, the sense of control grew stronger. Each stolen item, each piece of evidence, solidified his grip on the situation. He was no longer a victim, he was the puppeteer, pulling the strings of this man's downfall. Yet, there was a strange unease lingering beneath the surface. What was he becoming in the process? Was this what justice looked like, or was he spiraling into something darker? The laptop proved to be a goldmine, a deep dive into the lover's twisted existence. As the protagonist navigated through files, documents, and emails, the lover's secrets began to unfold like a horrifying puzzle. It wasn't just infidelity. There were illegal financial transactions, embezzlement, money laundering, and connections to organized crime. The man's carefully curated life was a farce, built on lies and criminal activities. The protagonist's satisfaction grew with each new revelation. This wasn't just revenge. It was justice in its purest, most vindictive form. With a cold, calculated calm, the protagonist began sending the lover's secrets to those who needed to know. The IRS was the first recipient of the lover's financial crimes, followed by the lover's employer, the company board members who had no idea their star employee was a fraud. It wasn't just about the affair anymore. It was about obliterating this man's entire life. As the emails were sent, the protagonist could already feel the weight of the consequences. The lover's life would never be the same, just as his own had been shattered. Meanwhile, the wife was dealing with the fallout of her public exposure. The lover, too, would face the world's harsh gaze. Both were trapped in the web he had spun, but now they were not just exposed, they were both being destroyed, in private and in public. The protagonist watched it all unfold, his heart racing, the final act of his revenge complete. But even as the satisfaction surged within him, he couldn't shake the nagging question. Was this truly the justice he sought, or had he become something else entirely in his quest for retribution? The aftermath of the protagonist's revenge was swift and brutal. The wife, once admired by many, was now a pariah. Her friends, family, and colleagues distanced themselves, unable to look at her without seeing the betrayal she had committed. The emotional weight of the public shame crushed her, and the once confident woman was left to deal with the consequences of her actions. The lover, too, faced a devastating fallout. His career was in shambles, his financial crimes now exposed to the world. His reputation was irreparably damaged, and he was left with nothing but the ashes of his former life. But as the protagonist watched their world crumble, he began to question his own choices. The sense of power he had once felt was now diluted with a gnawing feeling of emptiness. Was it worth it? He had taken everything from them: humiliation, financial ruin, and public disgrace. But in the silence that followed, he found little satisfaction. Instead, a deep regret began to creep in. Was this the justice he had sought? Or had his need for revenge simply made him a mirror of the very people he despised? The lines between right and wrong, justice and vengeance, blurred more than ever, and the protagonist was left to grapple with the rising conflict within. Did he truly feel vindicated, or was there more to the story, something he had yet to understand? The calm after the storm quickly dissipated. It wasn't long before the authorities began to piece together the chaos. The protagonist was arrested for arson, hacking, and a slew of other charges. His revenge, now an uncontrollable spiral into legal trouble. The police arrived at his door in the middle of the night, dragging him away in handcuffs as he was read his rights. His life, once a series of calculated moves in pursuit of justice, now teetered on the edge of a much darker reality. In the interrogation room, the protagonist sat alone, his mind racing. The air was thick with tension as the officers grilled him about the fire, the hacking, and the public exposure. He knew he had crossed a line, but the reality of the legal consequences hadn't fully settled in until now. Every question from the officers felt like another nail in his coffin, and his once steady resolve began to falter. The lawyer assigned to his case, a no-nonsense professional, wasted no time in highlighting the magnitude of the situation. "This isn't just a personal vendetta," the lawyer explained, pacing the room. "This is a series of criminal acts with far-reaching consequences. Arson, cybercrimes, public humiliation. This is no longer about an affair. This is a legal nightmare." The protagonist listened as the lawyer laid out the case against him, a sense of dread slowly creeping in. Was it all worth it? Was he now the villain in his own story? As he sat there, waiting for the next step, the protagonist reflected on everything he had done. Could this really be the justice he had sought? Or had he gone too far? The weight of his actions pressed down on him, and the answer seemed harder to grasp than ever before. Sentenced to a lengthy prison term, the protagonist was ushered into a stark new world. The prison gates slammed shut behind him, and the familiar comforts of his old life became a distant memory. Incarceration was a brutal awakening. The days stretched on endlessly, each one blending into the next. Prison life was harsh, rules were different, and the world he once controlled was now out of his hands. He met others, men who had their own stories of betrayal, loss, and revenge. Some had been wronged, others had committed worse deeds than he, but each man wore his own scars. As the days wore on, the protagonist began to reflect deeply on his actions. What had he truly gained from all of this? His quest for revenge had started as an attempt to right a wrong, but now, in the cold isolation of prison, he realized how hollow that victory felt. Revenge had promised closure, but it only seemed to open new wounds. Justice, he came to understand, was not something that could be forcibly claimed. It was something that had to be earned over time, with the willingness to let go. His sense of power, once so intoxicating, had faded. In its place, a new awareness began to form. A realization that revenge only perpetuated the cycle of pain. He wasn't a hero in his own story. He was just another person broken by betrayal, struggling to find meaning in the ruins of his own actions. And in that space of reflection, a small seed of redemption began to sprout, though the journey to truly understand what it meant to be free was still far from over. Months passed, and the protagonist found himself sitting in a stark, sterile room once more. This time it was the parole hearing, a chance to change his fate. The tension was palpable as he waited for his turn to speak. Would the board see his potential for change? Or would they condemn him to more years in the system, forever trapped in the shadow of his revenge? As the hearing began, the protagonist reflected on what he had learned during his time in prison. He had been angry once, angry at his wife, at the lover, at the world for betraying him. But now, sitting here, he realized that anger had only made him more of a prisoner than he had ever been. He had been seeking justice, but he had never allowed himself to truly heal. The board asked him questions, probing into his actions, his remorse, and what he had learned. The protagonist spoke of his reflections, how revenge had consumed him, how it had ultimately hollowed him out. He admitted to his mistakes, recognizing that while his actions had been fueled by pain, they had done nothing to bring him peace. As the hearing ended, the weight of uncertainty settled on him. Would he be granted parole, or would the past continue to define his future? The suspense hung thick in the air. There was no guarantee of release, no certainty of a fresh start. Yet, for the first time in a long while, the protagonist felt a flicker of hope that perhaps, just perhaps, he could find a way to rebuild a life beyond the wreckage of revenge. The protagonist's journey was a long one, filled with triumphs, regrets, and painful realizations. He had sought justice, but what he found was something more complicated: loss, self-doubt, and a deeper understanding of the consequences of his own actions. The question lingered. Had he truly found closure? Or had his thirst for revenge led him to a path of no return? As he reflected on the pain, the humiliation, and the choices that had led him here, one thing became clear: nothing would ever be the same. He had lost so much in the pursuit of vengeance, and yet the final outcome remained uncertain. Was peace possible, or would the scars of the past haunt him forever? Now, as his story nears its end, the audience is left to wonder: did the protagonist get the justice he deserved? Was the punishment worth it? Or was the true cost of revenge not found in the legal consequences, but in the loss of something far more valuable: his own humanity? Let us know your thoughts in the comments.